today we have really the honor to host Professor Chris Bale. Thank you, Chris, again for joining us. So his presence really represents an added value to the summer school. Chris Bale is Professor of Sociology and Public Policy at Duke University, where he directs the Polarization Lab and has the, I just took your incredible introduction from the website. So you're studying political tribalism, extremism, social psychology using data from social media, and tools from the emerging field of computational social science. So a Guggenheim Fellow and Carnegie Fellow. Chris' writings appear in Science, Nature, the New York Times, and his research has also been receiving attention by more than 60 media outlets, New York Times, New Yorker, Time Magazine, Wall Street Journal, Wired, Atlantic, etc., and so on and so forth. And his 2015 book, Terrified: How Anti-Muslim Fringe Organization Became Mainstream, received 3 awards. And now his widely acclaimed 2021 book, Breaking the Social Prism, was featured also in the New York Times, the New Yorker, and it's really inspiring. So he is also the editor of the University Oxford, the Oxford University Press series in computational science, social science, and the co-founder of the Summer Institute in computational social science that you were telling us before, right? And so to conclude, all I can say is that we are really excited to host your contribution, and we are really looking forward to listen to your talk. So the floor is yours, and thank you again a lot.
Okay, grazie, Laura, for that wonderful introduction. And it's a pleasure to meet all of you and to share with you some really new research that I hope will be interesting and relevant to all what all of you do. So this is a new project which we called Perceived Gender and Political Persuasion, a field experiment on social media. And this is part of a research effort that I founded at Duke University called the Polarization Lab. And we are a group of social scientists and computer scientists and data scientists who are both trying to do high quality research on polarization and associated topics, but also to build new technology to try to help counter trends that we're seeing on places like Twitter and elsewhere. So if you want to check out our work, you can come to the site polarizationlab.com, interact with our tools, learn more about our research. And a lot of our research has focused on sort of inter-party polarization, so tension between 2 political parties. We study the United States a lot too much. I would love for us to do more international research, but for now, we're mostly focused on the US. And in the US, as you may know, we're often talking about the conflict between Republicans and Democrats, but increasingly we've become concerned about the conflicts within parties too. So not just Democrats fighting Republicans, but Democrats fighting other Democrats, or what we call intra-party polarization. And that's sort of where we started to get excited about this work, which I should mention is co-authored with lots of really smart folks who come from 5 different scholarly fields. Some of them at Duke University, some of them in sociology, some of them in political science, some of them in statistical science, and also Brigham Young University, in the case of Lisa Argyle here, who's our political scientist. The other thing we wanted to study in this research is gender, and I'll talk a lot more about that as the talk goes on, why we think gender is particularly important for this intra-party polarization. But I'll just begin by trying to summarize very quickly a mountain of research on what is sometimes called the glass ceiling. And this is an analogy that is used to describe how women in many, many different fields seem to get very close to the top, but being able to see the top, see through this kind of proverbial glass ceiling, but they can't seem to crash through it. They can't seem to break through the glass ceiling in order to achieve equality with men in many, many different areas. So if we look at this recent data from the Wall Street Journal here, which is a large prominent newspaper in the United States, here we're seeing men are represented by these blue dots and women are represented by the purple dots. And pretty much no matter what job we look at, we see that there's a persistent gender gap. Everything from here, people who do billing and posting clerks, so administrative jobs. But interestingly, as we go up the ladder and income increases, as you can see on the y-axis here, we're showing income. The gap actually increases the more well-paid the jobs become. And so things like physicians and surgeons or lawyers or people who work in anesthesiology have the biggest pay gaps, which is sort of surprising insofar as you'd imagine that people who are very well educated would have perhaps more liberal gender ideals. But at least in the case of the United States, that doesn't seem to be the case. And so it's particularly interesting to think about the gender and politics gap, because politics is, after all, a fairly elite profession. Not many people become politicians. Most of the people who are politicians in most countries tend to be very well educated, wealthy, and so on. And sort of one of the interesting things we can do with the kind of wealth of data that's been created through a lot of different UN efforts, but also increasingly sort of digital data collection efforts, is to try to look at these disparities across countries. And we can see each country's trajectory here through a so-called gender gap index. And this is a large kind of messy index that describes a lot of different things. But as you can see, basically full gender equality would be up here, places like Iceland, where a majority of elected officials are female, and they have very progressive policies protecting women's rights. And it's been that way, as you can see, for the last 10 years here. But as we go down to places like Jordan, Iran, Syria, Pakistan, Yemen, the record is much less clear. And as we can see, in some cases, gender inequality has gone down, like in the case of Thailand here, and in other cases, it's kind of started to track up, like the United States. So it's an interesting question, how countries compare. Again, this talk will focus, unfortunately, mostly on the United States. And in the United States, there's been a lot of concern about gender inequality in politics. So we're going to focus in this study on gender and political influence. So imagine people trying to influence each other's views about politics. And there's a lot of interesting research about how gender shapes that process. This book by Christopher Karpowitz and Tali Mendelberg does some interesting experiments where they put people together in small groups, and the groups have different numbers of men and women in them. And basically what they find is that women tend to be much more influential upon the other people in the group if the other people in the group are female. And so when women are a minority, like they are in so many contexts in national legislatures or other elected positions, they often experience quite a bit of discrimination, and then also ultimately are less influential, according to this experiment where people were randomized to participate in political discussions in different settings comprised of different gender makeup. Another really important set of findings has to do with what sociologists like me often call role incongruence. And so role theory in sociology is simply the idea that society sort of creates expectations around different identity categories, such as male and female, and that when people deviate from these norms, they are punished for doing that. So there's social expectations for our behavior that we must sort of fulfill in order to fit in and be accepted by other people. The reason that we have these social norms is probably something like prejudice or stereotypes. And so, one of the ways to study stereotypes in the digital era that's I think particularly interesting and fruitful is to start to think about how the people who make the technology, like search technology, like Google, can we see evidence of that discrimination in those places? And these two images are from a paper by a group of graduate students and postdocs that basically obtained all the images associated with the Twitter accounts of both male and female elected officials in the United States. and then they pass them through Google's Image API, which is a tool that annotates images to kind of show people, you know, what types of things are, you know, associated with the image. And this is done, of course, by hiring people to annotate these images manually. So lots of people saw this and commented on, you know, that this looks like a business person or a speaker or an official. However, when people looked at this female elected politician here, you'll note that almost all of the annotations are about her physical characteristics, her chin, her hairstyle, and so on and so forth. And so, you know, broadly, this type of evidence suggests that we hold, you know, certain types of stereotypes about what a man should be and certain types of stereotypes about what a woman should be. But importantly, within the domain of politics, that those types of distinctions are still out there, that women, you know, there's a pervasive stereotype out there, my co-authors and I think, that that depicts women as somehow less capable in politics or less decisive as leaders. And even worse, when women try to act in a strong, decisive manner, they can be punished for doing so because it's incongruent with the social expectations that society has sort of set up for them. And we see this perhaps most famously in the case of like Hillary Clinton and the rhetoric around whether or not a woman could ever become president. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. President in the United States, of course, I recognize, of course, there's many heads of state internationally that are female. So our first hypothesis in this research is that people discredit women's opinions. Remember, we're studying interpersonal influence here. So conversations where people are trying to discuss, to influence each other about politics. And our first hypothesis is just that people will generally discredit women's opinions compared to men's opinions because of these pervasive stereotypes that are out there that depict women as somehow less knowledgeable, capable, or influential in politics. Our second hypothesis, though, is that women will have less influence, not just because of these stereotypes, but because their behavior can reinforce these stereotypes. So, you know, the classic sort of dilemma here is, you know, women faced with stereotypes, if, you know, if other people start to treat them in ways, for example, talking loudly over them or you know, criticizing them more than say men or things like this, that women may somehow internalize those stereotypes and then themselves act less aggressively, less strongly, or less decisively, that could compound or maybe even sort of validate those stereotypes in the eyes of others. And so we have both this first hypothesis, which is about stereotypes, but also this second hypothesis, which is about stereotypes, how stereotypes can change behavior. And this comes out of the work of the sociologist Irving Goffman, who famously showed how people who experience prejudice tend to adjust their behavior in order to avoid uncomfortable or situations or further stereotyping. And they kind of learn various ways of behaving to avoid or sort of dodge stereotypes that can ultimately and counterintuitively reinforce those stereotypes. Okay, so our study is conducted in the context of the 2020 presidential election in the United States, and specifically the primary election. So this is the election before the main election, where Joe Biden defeated Donald Trump. This was the election to decide which Democrat should go up against Donald Trump. And you all know probably Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, who are now the president and vice president. And at the time, you know, there were many candidates, but perhaps most notably, there was Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, who are more on the progressive side of things, who are more, you know, advocating more liberal policies, and Biden and Harris arguably were advocating more sort of mainstream policies. And a lot of people were doing the thought experiment at this time, you know, is Elizabeth Warren's you know, these two had such similar policies that the only thing that was really different about them was their gender. And the same conversation was sort of starting to happen around Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. And so we began to wonder, as we were watching this unfold, like, to what extent is gender, you know, driving people's thoughts about who can be elected and why, and to what, and more broadly, to what extent is gender going to influence how people try to decide who should go up against Biden in the general election. So this is the context in which we're studying. Our study is, I think, somewhat innovative in that we're trying to advocate for a new mode of research where we build technology to run field experiments in real life settings. So what we did is to create an app, which we called Unite Dem. And Unite Dem is an app that we basically created to help Democrats talk to each other about who would be the best person to face Donald Trump in the 2020 presidential primary election. And so we recruited a large group of people who said they were willing to use an app for pay. And as they came onto our platform, they were given a unique invite code, which, unbeknownst to them, paired them with someone from the other gender to have a conversation about who to elect. Now, when they came on the platform, they were asked a bunch of questions about which candidate they liked in various different ways that I'll talk about more in a little bit. And then we did an experiment that I'll describe in just 1 minute. Then people had a conversation, and then at the end of the conversation, we resurveyed people to see if their views had changed based on their chatting with the other person. So we had to, of course, make it look like this was a real app in the world that was fun to use, and so we had our team write reviews of our apps to just kind of make it look like a more fun and enjoyable thing to do. And actually, incidentally, we got feedback from the participants that it was kind of a fun thing to do because we rarely have the opportunity to sort of influence each other on a peer-to-peer level about each other's votes. So we think we kind of had a cool model for an app in general, let alone the opportunity to do research. Okay, so as I mentioned, people come on, they're told they're going to talk anonymously with another Democrat to decide who should be the next president from the nominee from the Democratic Party. They're told they have to send at least 14 thoughtful replies to their chat partners' messages to get paid for using our app. And then we ask them whether they're aware of all the different candidates, how they would rank them in terms of how they would plan to vote, and then independent of their vote, whether they like them or not, on a scale from 0 to 100, where 100 is liking them a lot and 0 is really not liking them. So the experiment here, which we used to try to evaluate our two hypotheses about whether stereotypes are driving gender discrimination or behavior is driving gender discrimination, was to actually try to randomize people's gender. So we have two people using this chat app to talk to each other about the election. And it's not a video app. There's no opportunity to share images of themselves or anything like that. So we realized that we sort of have an opportunity to actually randomize gender. So when people got to the next screen on the app, they saw a GIF video that with these spinning around avatars that made it look like they were about to be matched with someone in the study. And actually they were. We were dynamically matching them with other people in the study. And then we would show them, hey, we found a match for you to talk with. We gave them a gender neutral set of initials. But the innovation here was that sometimes we labeled the person they were talking to using that person's actual self-reported gender. So if it's a woman, you saw a female avatar, but half the time we mislabeled that person's gender. So you could be a man talking to a woman, but she appeared as a man to you. And so the idea is that then we can try to tease out what comes from prejudice or expectations about whether someone is going to be capable in discussing politics and influential, or what is actually in their behavior. And the behavior here is just limited to the text. So we're not capturing the many other mannerisms and body language that would be used to convey gender, just language. So next they were asked to start a conversation about this, and this generated a massive amount of data. So what we, in terms of text data. So basically what we have is 372 people who did this. And in the control condition, they see the actual gender of people, they have a conversation. And in the experimental condition, we mislabel one of the two people and see how that shapes what the other people think of the person who they're being interacting with, but also maybe more importantly, whether it changes their plans to vote or what they think of the candidates, and so on. So the two outcomes I'll describe mostly today are the candidate ranking change. So did the order in which they ranked the candidates change before and after they had the conversation? And then this feeling thermometer, the 0 to 100 scale of what they thought of the candidate, independent of whether they would vote for the candidate. And our hypotheses, just to refresh, is that men will be less influential if they are perceived as female because of these pervasive stereotypes, where we expect that people who see that they're talking to a woman will assume that the woman is somehow less capable in politics or less influential. And by the way, there's a lot of evidence in the literature in and outside politics that women also discriminate against other women. And hypothesis 2 is that women will be more influential if they are perceived as male. So basically what we're trying to do is say, what if we could turn men into women, they should be less influential. If we turn women into men, they should be more influential. And here is the results of the experiment. It's a little bit tricky to read through, so I'm first going to show you the data, and then I'm going to give you a substantive interpretation of what we think the data means. So this is the y-axis here, describes the difference between the influence of the man and woman. Remember that we're always looking at man and women talking in these chat apps on each measure. So positive values indicate that the man is more influential. And the dots are the point estimates of the gap with 90% and 95% confidence intervals. And the orange and green bars show the influence gap in discussions where one partner was mislabeled. So what we see here that is sort of surprising is mislabeling men as women reverses the influence gap, such that women are on average the more influential partner in those conversations. So for example, if a man is talking to a woman and we've mislabeled that man as a woman, he will be less influential. So that kind of sort of confirms our first hypothesis. But here's where it gets interesting and a little depressing. Mislabeling women as men increases men's relative influence, widening the gap. So what that means is that representing women as a man does not make them more influential. So our first hypothesis is confirmed, Our second hypothesis is not confirmed. So in other words, having men represented as women has a negative outcome, but changing women's gender to male doesn't increase their influence. So again, a disturbing finding, especially in light of the very important debate in the United States going on about gender and politics on this day, when we've just heard about the leaked Supreme Court decision around Roe v. Wade of the so-called abortion or the abortion legislation in our country. So now we're turning to another gap. So now we're looking at the conversation level. So this isn't just whether men are talking to women, this is overall in the conversation, treating everybody as a pair instead of an individual unit of analysis. And what we're looking at is how their thermometer ratings of each of the candidates changes if they're in the experimental condition where their gender has been mislabeled in the chat app. And the left panel shows the magnitude of disagreements and feelings towards candidates pre and post conversation by treatment condition. And the right panel explicitly shows treatment effects on the within conversation changes in feelings towards candidates. So this visualization depicts the absolute difference in thermometer rating for the same candidate across conversation partners within either the pre or post conversation survey. So I know this is really a tricky research design. So I'll give another interpretation of this finding in more straightforward language. Conversations where the man is mislabeled exhibit increases in disagreement that are significantly larger than the decreases in disagreement in correctly labeled conversations. Mislabeling the woman increases disagreement relative to control, but not at statistically significant levels. So basically what that means is that once again, mislabeling the man as a woman seems to hurt the man's influence and make the conversation converge less, like they don't have agreement on the candidates. But mislabeling the women as men does not seem to make that person more influential on the tendency for their rankings or thermometer ratings of the candidates to converge in the similar direction, to become more similar as an alternative measure of influence. So far we've kind of focused on the stereotype explanation, right? I've said that by randomizing gender in these conversations, we're trying to control those stereotypes, because we think that visual cue, which by the way stayed throughout the chat. So at the top right hand of the screen, you always saw this female or male avatar throughout the conversation. But remember, our second hypothesis was about behavior. And I mentioned that the only type of behavior we're looking at is the language. And so the sort of interesting thing we think we can do with these data is to say, well, now the only thing these people know about each other is what they're saying. There were cases where people disclosed their gender, and we've rerun our analyses by dropping those people and see similar results. But it was a very small percentage of cases. It was about 12 out of 372 conversations. So what we realized is we could use some tools from natural language processing and other forms of automated text analysis to try to detect whether language had become gendered, such that women were using female sounding language and men were using male sounding language, either making them sort of fulfill the stereotypes associated with their gender, or maybe creating that kind of role incongruence that I was talking about earlier, where we have social expectations for women to behave in one way, but if they sound like a man, then maybe they're perceived as being an overly aggressive woman. Or for men, if they sound like a female, maybe they're seen as not strong enough or something like that. So we discovered this interesting study that I've got on the slides here, where two political scientists went through a bunch of political speeches in a recent election period, and they hired people on Amazon Mechanical Turk to rate the words, every single word that appeared in these conversations as more female or male sounding words. So for example, if you were to talk about makeup, that would probably be coded as more female by women and maybe men too. Whereas if you were talking about really male aggressive things like maybe sports or maybe that's a bad example, but war or some kind of aggressive behavior, that would be understood by the people asking to code these things as maybe more male sounding language. And so the sort of cool thing is then this creates a dictionary, a set of terms and a set of probabilities that men or women will rate them as sounding like a man or sounding like a woman. And then we can apply this dictionary to our own data to try to see how our own respondents were behaving. Were they sounding more male or female? And most importantly, did the way that they were talking change when their gender was misrepresented? Because that would be evidence that there is some kind of behavioral thing going on. So the first sort of interesting thing going on here, we're seeing on the x-axis, as scores become higher, the language overall sounds more masculine, according to the tool I described in the previous slide. And if it becomes smaller, it's more feminine. And then we have the three sort of experimental conditions here. So this is if people were correctly labeled, this is if the man was mislabeled, and this is if the woman is mislabeled. And we do that for how the man in the conversation's language changes and how the women's language changes in the conversation. And essentially what you see is if men are correctly labeled, then they use very male language. And if women are correctly labeled, then they use very female language. I should say, by the way, these are small differences. These aren't like giant differences, but they are differences nonetheless. And what's sort of interesting is that mislabeled men maybe become a little bit more feminine, and mislabeled women, but mislabeled women really seem to adjust their language according to the gender displayed by the other person. So what's sort of remarkable here is that even though people are not seeing any visual information about the gender, we think they're sending information about each other's gender through their language. And so what's sort of really surprising though is that across all these treatment conditions, men use more male sounding language and women use more female sounding language, but mislabeling changes the average gendered language score for both the treated person, and the mislabeled partner. So what's really interesting is because we're only mislabeling one person at a time, you might expect that only the person seeing the mislabeled stuff would change their behavior. So like if I'm a man talking to a woman, and I think I'm talking to a man, and then I start talking about war or aggression or something like that, right? And that should only change my behavior, not the person I'm talking to, if you just believe it's about that visual. But what we're seeing is actually when we mislabel the woman as a man, the man starts to talk differently, like as if they're talking to another man, but then the woman also starts to talk in a more male way, which then changes the way this is happening. So what we think is really interesting about this research is how, this is a case where an experiment can change, both parties, which makes the causal inference and interpretation even more challenging, but also more interesting because it suggests, we think, that both the first hypothesis that we have about the role of stereotypes is sort of validated, as well as the second hypothesis about behavior, but that it's not just the behavior of women that's changing, it's also the behavior of men that's changing. And what's creating the gender inequality in the aggregate is a shift in both men and women's behavior that tends to reinforce inequality towards women in some way. So when one of the discussion partners is mislabeled, it changes both men's and women's behavior. Women use the most masculine language in situations where they themselves have been labeled as a man, even though that they don't know that they've been labeled as a man. In other words, the man in the conversation speaks differently to the woman because he thinks he's talking to another man. So to conclude, we think both of our hypotheses have some support in these data, that there's some evidence that gendered stereotypes are driving inequality in political influence in terms of gender, as well as their behavior. And the sort of most important thing we think is that probably gender inequality again results from a complex and dynamic interpersonal construction of gender. So there's a back and forth that sort of occurs between men and women that determines the trajectory of the conversation. And this is important, we think, because it means that gender cannot be easily or durably manipulated using the type of single static interventions that we see in a lot of experiments around gender, where you just have one person's gender changed as a hypothetical job candidate or as an elected official or something like that. So that suggests we need to be much more sensitive to the dynamic interplay of language, behavior, and stereotypes in producing gender inequality. Unfortunately, though, we think it also implies that the solutions to improving the gender influence gap are inherently difficult. So women cannot improve their levels of influence simply by talking more like men, or what's sometimes called leaning in the kind of popular conversation around gender. But neither can women become more influential without changing their behavior. So it suggests really there's this, again, a new kind of dilemma that women face as they try to achieve more influence in political conversations. There's a lot of limitations of this research. We're only looking at the United States. We're only looking at Democrats. So one could argue that gender stereotypes might be larger in the Republican Party, given that survey evidence seems to suggest that gender discrimination is more common among Republicans than Democrats. It could have just been something unique to the 2020 election in the United States. There were a lot of crazy things going on: Donald Trump, COVID, Black Lives Matter, many other things. Would we have seen similar results in different elections? We don't know. We also don't know whether this would apply to other members of stigmatized groups. For example, non-white or non-European people interacting with European people. Hypothetically, this study could be done instead of randomizing gender, but randomizing ethnicity or religion or something else like that. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, like we're only really studying language here, but there's probably many other things that go into the behavior that helps us judge each other's gender. And we're not measuring any of that here. So really, we can only discuss these effects in terms of exchanges of language. So finally, I know this is a great summer school, but I wanted to just briefly mention that I've been part of, I'm the director of the Summer Institutes in Computational Social Science, which is a free program that runs in 32 locations around the world. This year, we have sites both in Bologna and also in Delhi and Hyderabad. And basically, these locations offer 1 week, usually 1 week of training in some of the techniques that I described today. So digital experimentation, natural language processing, things like that, but also many of them offer the opportunity to incubate cross-disciplinary research during a second week. We hope that that will incubate a lot of creative research across disciplinary lines. In fact, some of the people on this project came onto the project at the Summer Institute in Computational Social Science at Duke University, where I am, in 2018. And unfortunately, our deadlines this year have mostly passed, not all of them. But if you want to learn more on your own, we have more than 4 days of video content that's freely available, created by 16 different experts in the field that you can watch or also incorporate into your own courses if you're a teacher. So I hope that resource is useful. That's we call it SICSS.io. And finally, here's how to get a hold of me. Here's how to learn more about our lab, the Polarization Lab. Here's my research unrelated to polarization. And here's the aforementioned Summer Institutes in Computational Social Science. And if you dare, here's how to follow me on social media. Thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you all today. And I look forward to discussing this stuff more with you.
Thank you. Thank you a lot, Chris. It was really a mind-blowing presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and yeah, now we'll start with a discussion session. So I hope that there are comments and reflections just on also to share. And I was wondering, listening to your presentation, I was thinking about the Me Too movement. So there is a feminist political movement who started from Twitter, so following all the digital platform dynamics and mechanisms, etc., that really was focused on gender as well, as we know. And I was wondering whether, considering all the orientation of the Polarization Lab, so if you could, I don't know, also just notice or have any kind of information that you could reach on the issue when a social cause such as the Me Too cause came into action so strongly through Twitter, through the digital language as well, the hashtags, etc. Talking about gender and language on platforms, and there was anything that you could find in latest research or some stimulus that you could share with us.
Yeah, sure. I mean, unfortunately, we weren't doing any research on gender at the time that Me Too was unfolding. We did have one experiment in the field that was related to Me Too, or was not directly related to Me Too, but was in the field at the time of Me Too. And that was a 2018 study where we paid people to follow Twitter bots that exposed them to messages from the opposing political party for a month. And one of the interesting things about that research is that the month where we were doing the experiment happened to be the kind of first big month of the Me Too movement. It was when Harvey Weinstein was accused of harassing many different women. And the one thing that was sort of interesting that we were never able to ultimately resolve is to what extent gender was driving our effects. And our effects were somewhat counterintuitively that if you follow someone from the other side, you tend to become more partisan, not less. So if you're a Democrat, you tend to become more Democrat when you follow a Republican. And if you're a Republican, you tend to become more Democrat if you follow a Democrat. And so that was somewhat surprising, and we were wondering what was driving that result. And if you look at the appendix for this 2018 paper, which is freely available online and linked on polarizationlab.com, you can see one of the explanations we couldn't ultimately throw out was that some of the effect, which was larger for Republicans than Democrats, was being driven by the fact that there are more female elected officials in the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. So it could be that one of the reasons Democrats really didn't seem to like Democrats' tweets is that there were more women tweeting on the Democratic side of the aisle. And we speculate about how that might have been related in that time. But I wonder if we can take a minute. I'm curious now, because as I mentioned, we're in this moment where we are watching a historic shift in U.S. gender politics, and I'm just curious what's out there right now, you know, in terms of the Me Too movement. And I wonder, just if we did a quick search, I'm curious, because I was about to say it seems that the movement is kind of slowing down,
Yeah.
but you know, I'll bet you know, it's very much alive today. I'm curious to see. Looks like we've got 97 tweets from a fair number of folks here, and across different languages too. Look, London, Germany, other places. Looks like it is getting factored into the abortion conversation right now. So maybe this is another moment where the movement comes back. You know, I don't know. Obviously, this is a a very small sample of tweets. If we have more time, we could collect more and look at them in a more interesting way, maybe. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how the current moment, whether that inspires a new wave of conversation around B2. I think it's probably too early to tell, given that this document was just leaked yesterday. But I certainly think that the broader conversation around gender and politics and gender and abuse is here to stay, because it's such a pervasive problem all around the world, as we've seen through the Me Too movement. So certainly it's kind of like interesting to see how social media in its best form can maybe enable disadvantaged groups to have some power. At the same time, we're all well aware that women and other disadvantaged groups bear the brunt of the harassment and abuse that occurs online as well. And I would direct you to, if you've not seen it already, Sarah Soberei's fine book, Credible Threat, which looks at some of the gender dynamics, the harassment online that are occurring. So it's certainly, on the one hand, I think it's a success story. On the other hand, I think there's a ton more work to do in this area.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
If you have any other comments from India as well, or anybody?
Laura, can I go next?
Yes, of course. The floor is yours.
Hello, Chris. It was a
Hi.
fantastic talk. And I've been following your summer school for around a year.
Oh,
because
cool.
we were actually planning to do some kind of a topic analysis on seeing how the discussion around digital payments were being pushed by certain stakeholders. And there was a lot of what would I say that, for example, the Central Bank of India's chairman was somebody who was using Twitter, and they were also hiring this micro influencers in Instagram and TikTok to push this kind of a movement. So, but I found a lot of difficulty in doing that, and we're still learning it because I am an ethnographer by practice. So it's quite new to me. But I had just two questions in this type of conversations that you had followed on these applications. Did you people actually at least prescribe certain topics that they should talk on, or was it a freewheeling conversation that they had? And if it was freewheeling in its sense, what are the type of topics they discussed in reality?
Yeah,
and I have a follow-up question. You can go ahead next.
Okay, yeah, sure. Those are both really good questions. The first, before I forget, on the influencer thing in India, you should check out the work of Dean Eccles, who I'm putting in the chat here, who has recently done some research with a graduate student who's from India, which looked at basically coordination of influence campaigns in WhatsApp data. That some people, like the way apparently, I don't know anything about this issue, but just from reading the paper, there's a really interesting new set of research, maybe seen it already, on how things get moved from one channel to another, which I think is something that we really don't know a lot about. And we really don't know a lot about the role of influencers in politics in general. With regard to the conversations, these were totally free form. We only asked them to discuss which candidate they thought was best positioned to defeat Donald Trump. So we didn't say talk about healthcare, this group, and talk about race, this group, or anything like that. The topics are sort of as you might imagine, pretty far ranging. We've built a tool and the part of the problem in doing a topical analysis of data like this is that most of the messages are pretty short. And so if you have a short text, it's particularly difficult to do techniques like topic models. And I'm putting in the chat here a paper that we wrote to develop a method for doing topic analysis on short tweets, which we applied to this data. I don't have I can't show you like a plot of what words we're taught. We don't have that yet. We're sort of early in the analysis, but so far we've had both a lot of people running topic models and other forms of word embeddings and all sorts of stuff to try to, and actually in our paper we have an appendix about running all sorts of different text analysis techniques through these data. But we don't see any strong signals that one topic is coming up over another. I mean, a lot of people are just talking about the candidates. They do of course talk about healthcare. They do of course talk about the issues. So it's hard to say, and it's sort of hard to study. We've also we do a lot of qualitative research in our group too. So we've actually read I haven't, but some of the students on the team have actually read all of the conversations to try to get a broader high level sense of exactly what's driving the results. And we haven't yet found the smoking gun in terms of the substance of the topic, which is why we think it's the style of the language that matters more than the substance, but it's certainly a really good question.
Just from just being curious about it, it's also a movement in the United States where a lot of people are discussing about cancel culture over Twitter. Right?
Yes.
I would just like to know your views of, first of all, how do we understand this kind of a moment in history? Because this seems like a very orthodox step, but it's being also taken by a lot of Democrats in saying that, like, especially I could remember this Netflix special by Dave Chappelle, which had so much discussion that went around it.
Yeah.
So I was just thinking, how do you see this entire movement, and how, as this kind of a researcher, how can we use Twitter as a tool to understand this?
Yeah. They're both really good questions. I mean, it's hard to answer quickly because I've just written a whole book about social media and politics called Breaking the Social Media Prism. I don't really talk very much about cancel culture in the book, but I do talk about a broader theme, which is about sort of the gap between social media and reality, and how I think that's one of the most dangerous, sources of intergroup tension and polarization, and many of the sort of negative outcomes of that are going on in many different societies around the world today. And I certainly think cancel culture is one of them. I mean, the ability for a Twitter mob to sort of show up out of nowhere and then cancel someone is we've all seen it. It's really quick and powerful and ruthless. But I think the seeming power of that mob, right? It could just be a small cadre of very active Twitter users that are doing most of the canceling, right? And so we all have the perception that we are being canceled by everyone, and everyone doesn't like what we're saying, but it's probably much more likely that a small group of very active, highly opinionated, maybe very extreme people are doing the canceling. And so if we can approach social media knowing that, I think our fear of being canceled will be a little less severe. Yeah. That said, there's plenty of people in the United States anyways losing their jobs for things they said on social media. And so I do think cancel culture is a thing. I think probably its power is a little overstated, but it's also got dynamics across subgroups. So one of my graduate students, Fatima Al-Kabandi, did a really interesting study looking at how basically experimenting whether people are willing to disclose sensitive opinions, whether in an experiment where they either think they're talking to a member of their own party or the other party. And basically what we find is that people are more reluctant to disclose their unpopular views to a member of their own party rather than the other party. So some of cancel culture is also coming from within parties, which is an understudied and important dynamic. And again, one of the reasons we've become interested in studying intra-party polarization instead of inter-party polarization.
Thanks.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, if there are any other contributions. I was thinking about cancel culture in the meantime. I was thinking about cancel culture, and you said that maybe that's not such a matter if we think that it's more employed by extremists, right? That's more or less the view. But I was reflecting that sometimes cancel culture also might be expressed with not saying something, not just what has been said, but sometimes in order to avoid any kind of reaction near to a counseling or just a rejection from the audience of the social media, sometimes the discussion is really, obviously, as you said, polarized in that sense, because sometimes not saying I'm with it means I'm against it. That's a kind of I was studying some phenomena about it, and obviously the algorithms and all the dynamics of platforms allow for a polarized conversation, and so it might facilitate this kind of attitude. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I think again, the real danger is that if it has this preemptive effect where it's not just that we won't say risky things, but that we will shut off our voices altogether. That's certainly something that we saw in a lot of the research that we did for the book that I described, Breaking the Social Media Prism. We noticed, importantly, that moderate people are much more likely to censor themselves than extreme people. And so what that sort of paradoxically reinforces the power of these small group of people to describe themselves as representative of, or act as if they were representative of the majority. So yeah, I mean, the fact that moderate people are disengaging is a big problem, and I wrote a whole chapter about that in this recent book. So certainly I think that's part of cancel culture. I think cancel, when people recognize there's a risk to their job or their family or the welfare of their children or something like that, they're definitely going to disengage. And unfortunately, places like Twitter have become so toxic that a lot of people feel like the risk of posting about anything sensitive there far outweighs the benefits.
Thank you. That's really interesting.
Sure.
Okay, I don't know if we have any more.
I'm fine to wrap up too. It's been a pleasure to meet you all, and I'm so excited to hear about a collaboration like yours between Bologna and the Indian Institute of Technology. It's exciting to see these connections being made, and I hope we'll stay in touch.
Yes, we hope the same. And
okay. Take care. Okay, yeah, sure. Bye-bye.
Well, and thanks to all participants.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.